Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. Today we're looking at Eruth, Tormented Prophet. So Eruth is a 3-mana Izzet commander, and she's a 2/4 that says if you would draw a card, exile the top 2 cards of your library instead, you may play those cards this turn. So all of our card draw is replaced with Impulse Draw for 1 more than the card we would have drawn. So this means a couple of things. Obviously, anything that we had that would normally draw a card is now effectively doubled since we get 2 cards per draw. However, those cards are only impulse drawn, so we don't get to retain them, which means we do need to be able to play them immediately, which means those cards either need to be cheap or we need fast mana to add a bunch of mana to our pool so that we can keep churning through stuff. It also means that any cards that would normally have a downside, so for example, you draw a certain amount of cards, but then you have to discard a certain amount of cards, well, the discarding part doesn't matter because we are impulse drawing the cards anyway, so being empty-handed is irrelevant a lot of the time. So with that said, we have a lot of cantrips, an absolutely ton of cantrips, and basically whatever we could find that would be a 1-mana spell that draws a card is pretty much going into the deck, especially if it's red, because our fast mana is going to add red to our pool more often than we can add other colors. Therefore, if it's red, it was more valuable than being blue. But with that said, there are also a pretty good amount of cards to point out that don't just draw 1 card. So obviously there's some that draw 2, like Might of the Meek and Highway Robbery. And then we've also got our cards like Brainstorm. This card becomes 1 mana, draw 6 when we've got Eruth in play. Similarly, Cephalid Coliseum, we don't care if we have to discard because it's just sack the Cephalid Coliseum, draw 6. Similarly, cards like Control of the Court and Goblin Lore, which are draw 4, then ditch 3 at random. These become 2 mana, draw 8. Gix Probe becomes 0 mana, draw 2. So we just get to leverage a lot of card advantage out of these. Then we've got our additional card draw here, so something like Breakthrough, which normally we would just cycle all the cards in our hand. Here, this basically is 1 mana, draw 8. And Wheels in particular, so things like Wheel of Fortune, Winds of Change, and Time Twister, all of these cards become, draw 14, and then discarding of our hand didn't matter at all. Some other cards to point out are Surge of Brilliance, draw a card for each spell you've cast this turn from anywhere other than your hand. We are going to be impulse drawing a lot, obviously. And File of Galadriel, which among other things says if you would draw a card while you have no cards in hand, draw 2 cards instead. So when we do get empty-handed, this is basically another version of our commander. And when we have our commander in play, oh boy, we get to draw a lot. So then we've got the fast mana, of course. We're going to be impulse drawing a bajillion cards, so we need a ton of fast mana in order to take advantage of all of those cards. So as you can see here, most of this generates red mana. The only exceptions are Lotus Petal and Stormkiln Artist, but everything else only generates red, which is why we want our card draw to skew heavily red. So how are we actually winning the game? Well, we can either do the Underworld Breach LED Brain Freeze loop to mill out all of our opponents, or if we have enough ways of storming through our impulse draws, we can use Unstable Amulet as a way to just keep triggering and dealing damage to all of our opponents. Now, we do need to deal, hypothetically, up to 40, but it is actually possible to do that in this deck, and the Unstable Amulet itself is good enough as just a card that allows us to impulse draw at least once. Some other cards worth mentioning, Memory Worm is extremely good in this deck. Whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, this deals 2 damage to target player. That player discards a card, then draws a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Memory Worm. So, like Unstable Amulet, this can be a card that burns opponents, but more importantly, this is a card that allows us to just keep rummaging when we're doing storm turns, and in particular, we don't have to discard the card to draw a card. So as long as we've got the life to pay, we can keep drawing more off of this for free every time we cast something from exile. So every single Rite of Flame, Seething Song, etc. becomes another 2 cards that we get. We also have Sensei's Divining Top and Helm of Awakening as further cards to continue to cast things for cheap, especially Helm of Awakening, reducing the cost of all of our spells, and Top filtering through things. Top in particular is good as a card that we can play, we can then activate it, putting it back on top, and then our next impulse draw will be the top plus another card. So basically, once we get top plus Helm of Awakening, this is free, or anything else that would get a mana off of the Sensei's Top, like Burgi or whatever. So we draw, but instead of drawing, we of course impulse draw. This goes back to the top of our deck, and this is one of the impulse draws, and then we impulse draw the other card, so this also just goes through our whole deck. We of course have a suite of counter spells in order to protect Eruth, although it is notable that none of these cards really do anything during our storm turn, so obviously these cards cannot be played proactively. Then we have 30 lands, pretty straightforward here, the only standouts being Cephalid Coliseum and Pinnacle Monk. Some protection that is not in the form of counter spells as a way to keep Eruth alive or not get countered. A little bit of ramp, although we don't actually need that much in our deck because all of our fast mana compensates for this. And it's worth noting that anything that costs 0, like Chrome Mox, Mox Diamond, and Mox Amber, get to be played for free off of our impulse draws. Some removal, obviously our deck completely dies to Rule of Law effects, so we do need ways of getting rid of those things. And then as mentioned before, our wheels. Now aside from all of that, there was a lot, and I mean a lot, of additional card draw and cantrips that we could have raid. And in particular, I'm not even running Rhystic Study or the One Ring in this deck because we just have so much draw power at a cheaper rate than these cards. I also opted not to play any of the cost reduction for instant and sorcery spells, so cards like Baral and Ral. I felt like our spells were mostly pretty cheap, and we also have Helm of Awakening to reduce costs, as well as just a ton of fast mana, and I didn't feel like all these extra ramp spells were necessary either. So anyways, with all that being said, that is going to do it for Eruth, Tormented Prophet, and EDH.